Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on UK public attitudes to national security data processing. This is the first session in a series of CETaS public webinars that we're organising from now until the end of the year. My name is Ardi Janjeva. I'm Engagement Lead at the Centre for Emerging Technology and Security, CETaS, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. The webinar today is based on recent research carried out by CETaS. For those of you who are not familiar with CETaS, we are a research centre based at the Alan Turing Institute. We were launched in 2022, and we have the remit of strengthening UK security through pioneering research and insights on emerging technologies. Our research in CETaS seeks to enable responsible innovation of emerging technologies, assess global threats and opportunities, and shape policy on high priority security issues. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming the authors who conducted the study which the webinar today will focus on, Professor Marion Oswald and Ardi Janjeva. Marion is Senior Visiting Fellow at CETaS and also Professor of Law at Northumbria University. She has over 30 years of experience working at the intersection of law, technology, privacy, AI, policing, and national security. Her scholarship has looked closely at issues of fairness, oversight, and how data and automated systems are used by public bodies. Ardi is a Senior Research Associate at CETaS. His research covers three broad areas. One around AI innovation and disruption, and that includes AI safety and security. The second area is around intelligent tradecraft and investory powers. And the third area is around the political economy of emerging technologies and geostrategic competition. The topic of today's session is based on the CETaS research report, UK Public Attitudes to National Security Data Processing, Assessing Human and Machine Intrusion. We know that emerging technologies, including AI and machine learning, are transforming how national security agencies process data, with opportunities to improve efficiency, but also new risks to privacy and fairness. Despite the importance of these issues, there has been little empirical research into what the UK public thinks about national security data processing. This is the first of its kind study in the UK, where we're aiming to fill that gap, and it combines findings from a survey of over 3,000 UK adults and a citizens panel to understand public perceptions in depth. The findings from the research are especially timely as the UK policy debates in this space are advancing rapidly around issues concerning AI, investory powers, oversight, data protection, and how emerging technologies shape national security practices. The way the public perceives these developments, their trade-offs, their risks, their benefits is crucial for legitimacy, trust, and policy design. These are just some of the issues that Ardi and Marion will unpack today. Before we kick off, just some very, very brief housekeeping. The webinar today is being recorded and the video will be available on the YouTube channel of the Alan Turing Institute. The chat function is turned off, but we encourage people to ask questions through the Q&A feature here on Teams. And people are welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation. We'll come to them at the end during the dedicated Q&A slot. Once again, welcome. And I'm delighted to hand over to Ardi to kick us off.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm just going to get ready to share my screen. Great. Okay. You should all have that now. Cool. Yeah, thanks, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. You've already introduced Marion, so I don't need to do that, but we'll be sharing the findings from some, so let me just move this slide on, from some research that we published back in April, actually, looking at public attitudes to national security data processing, especially how the UK public might feel as new technologies are increasingly used in the operationalization of investigatory powers. The first quick thing to note here is that Rosamund Powell, our colleague who led on this work, is no longer at CETaS. She moved on to a new role, but I'm sure Mary and I can do a sterling enough job explaining the key findings and all the rest of that. Cool. So this is pretty much the agenda for today. We'll start off with a bit of background around the project, and some details on the methodology and things like that. Then get into the key findings, working through them pretty much one by one, and then we will elaborate a little bit on what some of our conclusions are and what some of the next steps might be for the key audiences for this research. So why do we think this research is important? Two key reasons, really. First, and more generally, we really think it's essential for national security agencies to understand what shapes public trust in order to maintain their democratic license to operate throughout this decade into the next and beyond. The current evidence on how the public feel about national security is quite fragmented. There have been various sort of high-level polls and different sort of surveys in different areas, but not much work that's looking specifically at data or technology. And we've been especially, I think, sorely lacking in more deliberative work, the sort of stuff that we did as part of this project, sort of citizen juries, citizen panels, and things like that. Secondly, our previous research prior to this, stuff that Marion and I and other colleagues have worked on over the years, has identified quite thorny policy challenges where experts disagree, especially academic and legal experts, but where it's quite tricky to predict how the public would feel. And we use the sort of comparison between human intrusion and machine intrusion as an example to sort of to exemplify this, really. More on that afterwards as well. So just on the project scope, three key things we were interested in with this. First, how do the public feel about national security agencies and law enforcement processing a range of different data sets across a range of different contexts? How do the public feel about that data processing being automated, including through machine learning? And third, what policies do the public expect from government to underpin trust in data processing, especially automated data processing? That should give you a good idea of what our sort of fundamental research questions were, and I think we did our best to stick to these throughout the several months that we ran this project. So on the methodology, we adopted a mixed methods approach, really. So our first big undertaking, I should say, we prior to any sort of survey or citizen assembly, we did our sort of standard open source literature review, gathering all the sort of relevant information and insights on studies and different surveys and polls that had already been conducted in this space. So that's also included in this. But focusing on the sort of the big our sort of big ticket items here. The first one was a nationally representative survey with featuring over 3,000 people, plus a boost of young adults aged between 18 and 24, and there were over 500 of those. So around about 3,500 people in total. And this survey gave us really a snapshot of the public's instinctive, perhaps uninformed in some cases, reactions, or unprompted at least, reactions to a range of data processing prompts. And it also gave us the opportunity to make certain demographic comparisons as well. And our second big undertaking here was a three-part citizen panel featuring the same group of 33 adults across three different sessions, two of which were done virtually over the course of an evening session, and the third one being done in person in London. And this was recruitment for this was done to be nationally representative. Yeah, there are more details on exactly how we did that recruitment and stuff like that, both for the survey and for the citizen panel in the annex of the report itself, if that's your thing. And yeah, so the citizen panels really gave us much more considered, perhaps, views from a much smaller group, which gave way to, I think, nuance on how how the public weigh up the difficult trade-offs that are inherent to national security data processing. So I think both of the methods gave us different things. Was incredibly valuable in their own right. But naturally, I think when you're engaging with the sort of same group of 33 people over the course of a couple of weeks, you are able to get into a lot more detail and, ask questions on the go, and or rather have them ask you questions on the go, and get them to think a bit more dynamically. So onto our key findings here. So first, I'll try to summarize all of the most important takeaways at quite a high level, and then we'll dive into all of this in more detail. So the first key area that we looked at was support for national security data processing across a range of contexts. And the key finding here is really that support is in general high, but we found that young and vulnerable adults are significantly less supportive than other groups. So this is where our sort of boost of young adults in the survey and consideration of vulnerable adults has proved especially useful. We also found a wide spread of views and a substantial minority, around 20%, that were opposed across all the contexts that we tested. So what you might describe as a sort of a sticky sort of section of the population who are really sort of resolute in their views and distrust of certain sort of government institutions and data processing in general. The second key area of interest for us was what are the key factors in influencing public support? And we found public support is very dependent on context. So, for example, the public will have different reactions depending on what data is being analyzed and for what purpose. And a really key factor shaping public trust is the existence and the nature of oversight. So our key takeaway here really was that existing oversight mechanisms have a lot of potential to build trust, but are perhaps currently being somewhat underutilized because understanding was still very patchy across members of the public. And the third area that we looked at was this question I mentioned earlier around human versus machine intrusion. And I think our findings here were quite interesting, I think, because they suggested that human and machine processing are actually seen as quite similarly intrusive by members of the public. Perhaps has something to do with the idea that the initial data collection that takes place is in itself intrusive, and so the sort of end means are perhaps less relevant. It's that initial processing and collection that people see as important. But there is a lot of variation underneath that, which we'll get into later again. But perhaps more importantly, the finding suggests that the public won't necessarily be opposed to a method simply because it's more intrusive. Instead, and this takes us on to the final set of findings, the public care really is much about using the most accurate and the most fair method. So automation can still be favored if it's more accurate than a human, irrespective of whether it's seen as intrusive. And finally, also in line with this, quality assurance and human oversight were really important to the public in the context of any automation being used. We'll get into more of the specifics of what they might want that quality assurance and oversight to look like closer to the end. So just to set the scene on the findings on the screen here, it's important to bear in mind that the UK public have quite low awareness of national security agencies' work and of their powers to process data. The majority, 64%, are at least somewhat aware that agencies have powers to collect information about people in the UK without their knowledge, but most wouldn't really know the specifics. And certain aspects of national security data processing did come as a real surprise to members of the public. So, for example, how much data can be collected, the nature of international intelligence sharing partnerships, and again, how much oversight is actually in place. Things like the double lock, for example. So touch on this support for national security data processing being high, but not universal. Would perhaps be cautious of generalizing too much from what you see on the slide here, but across the context that we tested, like I say, support for processing was high. Because as you can see, there's more support than opposition across the different data sets that we asked about. But also worth noticing that at least 23% opposed, even to public social media posts of a person of interest being analyzed. And that was something which we were keen to, this idea of the intrusiveness of public posts being monitored and processed. That was something which we were keen to discuss with our sort of participants in the citizen panel as well. Also not captured on the graph is the similar number, around 20% across many of the data sets tested, who said they neither support nor oppose. Lots of this will be don't knows, which is it's often I think a key thing here to not just focus on the yes and no's and the support and oppose. But the don't knows are pretty important, especially with a topic like national security data processing, and that's something which we sort of notice in a few of these different questions. Also notable here is that support is quite high for police, if a little less high than for national security, and this chimes quite closely with the findings of the citizen panel. I mentioned earlier at the beginning, people on sort of both ends of the spectrum, those who think that national security really has to trump human rights across different scenarios, and are really they were really sort of motivated by slashing the red tape and get the investigations done, and there's a sort of terrorism case to solve. But also you get those who are broadly distrustful of the institutions involved. They often sort of won't believe that the information that's being shared publicly is accurate anyway. So those are your sort of people on the extremes, but then most people in the middle who have that nuance and sort of understand that their view is really quite dependent on context. Here we can see that young adults are less supportive than older adults of national security agencies processing across a range of data sets. Now, this might not necessarily be incredibly surprising, but should probably still be a cause for concern, or at least consideration. I think there's a need to understand, especially for the government and national security community, whether these people will maybe follow that sort of standard narrative of being more tolerant of perhaps be more tolerant of surveillance, or being more trustful of government and institutions as they grow older, or whether there's a sort of fundamental shift in attitudes that's taking place here amongst this younger generation, whether that will persist throughout the years. So that's something that's really important to get a hold of. Meanwhile, vulnerable adults are less supportive than non-vulnerable adults of this data processing as well, and I think I touched on that at the beginning too. I think I'll be handing over to Marion now to take us through a few more findings before I come back in.
Thanks very much, Ardi. So we looked at support for data processing across different data sets. As everyone will be aware, not all data is the same. So we considered public posts on a social media site, biometric data, so things like fingerprints, facial recognition, data on which phone numbers they've been in contact with and when, so comms data in this case, information about their location and when travelling in public, content of text messages from their phone, and identifiable medical data from general practitioner records. So you can see, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, that support for data processing was highest when public posts were being analysed, but there was still 23% opposed to this, and discussions in our citizens panel revealed that some people still had expectations of privacy around publicly posted material. There's a quote here from the citizens panel: "There's still some level of intrusion, even if it's a public post. most of the time, even with public things, you only look at things that relate to you or someone you know. You wouldn't just go out there to search for data. I feel like they're both intrusive. So I think that illustrates something that's has been written about a lot in academic research, that even if something is posted publicly, doesn't mean to say that people don't think there's still some level of privacy in that data, because the context of the way it's used and looked at and posted matters a lot. You can see also that there's a difference in support for communications data versus the actual content of messages being analysed, which support is a little bit less, but maybe not as much as you might have expected. And it's interesting that there is a relatively high level of support for biometric data analysis. And perhaps that's due to a higher level of awareness of why that sort of data would be processed in this context, or it might be to do with the fact that people are quite aware of that data and use it themselves, for example, on their own phones. Go to the next slide, please. So we also looked at the context in which data is processed to see how that affected perceptions. So we looked at a number of different contexts to investigate terrorism and serious crime, to detect foreign government spies, to investigate a crime to which you are suspected to be connected, to shape long-term strategies and policies, to create a new automated tool for predicting future behaviours, to monitor political views and preferences and share with political parties, and finally to share with commercial organisations. So again, it won't be surprising to see that support is a lot higher for data analysis in specific operational contexts, so such as investigating crime and terrorism. And these are by far and away the biggest differences in levels of support observed throughout the survey. So it really shows that context is key to whether data analysis activity is supported. You can see also, again, unsurprisingly, that perhaps the lowest level of overall support is around the monitoring of political views, and also sharing with commercial organisations. And of course, that sharing with commercial organisations is a little bit out of context. I mean, there may be good reasons why an organisation may need to share with a commercial organisations, but overall, that is the lowest level of support that we see. You can also see that the two rows above that are about long-term strategies and creating new automated tools. The support isn't as high here, probably to do with a large level of uncertainty around what that means. You can see in the neither support nor oppose column quite a large percentage in there. So people are not really confident what it means to shape long-term strategies or to build new automated tools, new AI tools. Why is data being used for that? And I think that's a useful observation, and the need to talk more about why personal data might be needed for those reasons. Have the next slide, please. So during our citizens panel, the participants had various learning sessions about the national security data analytics context, and they learned about the existing oversight that was in place through the Investigatory Powers Act. And one of our most important and strongest findings was how important this oversight is to fostering support for data analytics activities. And when people are not aware of this oversight, they assume that national security data processing is a bit of a free-for-all, but when they know it's in place, they're much more likely to trust the agencies to process data, even if they think it's intrusive. So that oversight is a real key element. And the vast majority of our participants in the citizen panel actually chose this as a key lessons learned across all the sessions when they did their final questionnaire. So you can see a couple of examples of quotes to illustrate this on the slide here. So one of the participants said, "I thought the government had much more freedom to just take data." And another participant said, "There are a lot more layers that the agencies have to go through to get approval than I realised." The next slide, please. So, however, while the existing oversight regime did bring more support, there was quite a lot of discussion and suggestions for how it could be adapted and potentially improved in the future. And lots of those suggestions focus on the need to raise awareness around how data is processed and how the agencies are overseen. And while one participant said to us that in their view, when national security agencies communicate publicly, it's all about the glamorous stuff, you know, what's gone well, you know, what potentially the risks externally are. But she wanted to know how it affected her as a citizen in the UK and how the checks and balances were implemented. And participants also said that they wanted more direct consultation with the public to maintain trust and also to maintain diverse input on policy decisions. And they said it was very frustrating to have no input, and wanted to emphasize that they could do justice to the nuanced challenges and considerations that national security faces. And I think it's fair to say that we were all really impressed by the level of engagement that was entered into by the citizen panel and how everyone was really able to do justice to the questions that we were looking at. So again, a couple of quotes on the slide to illustrate this. One participant said, "The assumption is that we don't need to know. What we're saying is actually a lot of the public have more capability than we are being given credit for, and we do need to know. Conspiracy theories then arise from that," somebody else said, "just through ignorance. And I appreciate sometimes ignorance is necessary in order to carry out covert intelligence. That's understandable. But I think we need a better understanding as a public." So this theme of transparency and consultation was a really important one throughout the citizens panel. Next slide, please. And finally, for me, we looked at a range of safeguards and whether these were seen as important by the public. And as you can see on the screen, we looked at the secure storage of personal data. We looked at independent oversight body conducting inspections, the approval of a senior judge, transparency initiatives, also a senior person internally within the agency assessing things, an independent court being ready to respond, and also finally an action being approved by a senior government minister. And we can see that not all safeguards were seen as equally important. It was that independent oversight and the secure storage that was seen as the most important. And unfortunately, the action of being approved by a senior government minister was seen as the least important. So that element of independence and the role played by judiciary were really important for building trust. And finally, this concept of proportionality, which is so central to the Investigatory Powers Act, was seen as important by individuals, but people questioned its subjectivity and its transparency. Somebody said, the trouble with this word proportionate is that it sounds great, but it's a judgment. So I suppose the question is, should there be a more open set of criteria? And I think anyone who's tried to deal with proportionality would have a lot of sympathy with that. And this suggestion of laying out much more transparency of how the judgment is made, I think is a really interesting one. So I'll hand back to Ardi now.
Thanks, Marion. Yeah, really useful having all of those quotes, I think, brought to life and on the screen as well. So great. Moving us on to the final sort of set of key findings. This one is around how automation and machine learning shape people's attitudes towards data processing. So I sort of alluded to it at the beginning, a long academic and legal debate surrounding the relative privacy intrusion of human versus machine-based data processing, differences in opinion across UK courts and European courts and so on and so forth, which I won't go into too much detail on, but I think the main point to take away from that is if we were to get towards something, I think if we were to get something closer to consensus on this issue of human versus machine-based processing and intrusion, it would have quite a few policy implications because of the imperative that the national security agencies have to minimize privacy intrusion associated with data processing. So that's some of the sort of big picture sort of context around that as well. So thinking about the survey first, to investigate our research question around human versus machine intrusion, we ran a 2x2 factorial experiment whereby different survey participants saw different versions of the same scenario. So some participants saw a scenario involving a human reading through all of the data, whereas others involved an algorithm that filtered out irrelevant data before it was seen by a human. So that was designed to investigate whether the public perceived the automated scenarios differently from the human scenarios. And from this, we didn't really pick up on any statistically significant difference in the intrusiveness of data processing, and nor did the public perceive the human or machine to be fairer, nor did that really translate into more support for one over the other. So obviously this is just based on one context, namely a live terrorism investigation, and there is some, I think there are some constraints on that because it sort of is really some limitations to that because it's confronting the public with a very urgent, high risk, high stakes scenario. So I think more work would be needed to really dig into how this varies depending on the scenario that's being explored. But I think it does suggest that the public's perception of privacy isn't fully tethered to whether a human is seeing their data. And from the citizens panel, this was largely backed up. Here we found people with a wide variety of views on this, many finding that data collection without consent would be intrusive no matter what happened afterwards. And a small group did find automated processing to be significantly less intrusive because they thought that machines lacked things like memory and judgment, which they thought were sort of uniquely human traits, which is perhaps up for debate from a technical perspective, but that's what we found nonetheless. And a smaller group still finding that automated processing was more intrusive because of their worries around mission creep and more data being processed just because automation makes it possible, basically. So overall, our findings in this space, I think, suggest that there was no clear distinction between the intrusiveness of human and machine processing in the eyes of the public, and so that this shouldn't necessarily be the basis for choosing one method over another from the perspective of government. So that really tees up this next finding that levels of perceived intrusion didn't determine levels of support from the public. So in discussions around which method was more intrusive, participants in the citizens panel frequently shifted the discussion to focus instead on two other priorities. First being whether oversight had been applied to this, and the second being whether the algorithm being used was fair and accurate. And we also found that citizen panel members often steered the debate to focus on what they saw as the most effective methods of investigation. So they would really be drawing this distinction between intrusiveness and effectiveness. And I mentioned this earlier as well, but you had then a small number of participants who took this line of thinking really to its extreme, relegating privacy considerations very far down their list of priorities in the event of a terrorism investigation. So another finding was in response to the choice between human and machines, something which most participants saw as a bit of a false choice. They saw humans and machines as having weaknesses that the other could perhaps mitigate, while also not necessarily being able to replicate the other's strengths on their own. So, for example, some people saw machines as being quite poorly placed to replicate humans' innate ability to consider emotion, display empathy, and recognize mitigating factors. But then others were concerned about the risk of overemphasizing these traits in humans, in human analysts, at the risk of opening up decision making to human biases, which perhaps machines could have a more neutral disposition towards. One insight here was linked to the severity of the crime being investigated. So the more severe the offense, the more important it was seen as having both a human and a machine analyzing the data. I think that's quite interesting. And as well as the severity of the offense, its sort of time horizon, its immediacy was also seen as more relevant to a more machine-based approach. So I think drawing out this link between automation, efficiency, and urgency, an interesting sort of trio there. And in general, over-reliance on any one method was broadly discouraged. There were concerns about cost constraints in the current economic fiscal climate, leading us too quickly down the road of automation, perhaps even leading to blind trust in automation. And in this regard, the example that cropped up quite frequently, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the Post Office Horizon scandal. But on the other hand, there were concerns also that over-reliance on human decisions could then lead to delays which could be quite costly to security. Attitudes towards national security embracing new technologies were varied, but there was definite enthusiasm for innovation, with participants saying, for example, that national security needs to continue to invest, continue to develop and learn, and never reach good enough. One participant argued that agencies must consider, is it not fair to use the tools at their disposal? But this enthusiasm is again highly dependent on context and on certain conditions being met. Notably, in the citizens panel, we found people were very wary as soon as technology was being used to predict rather than to classify, and that additional safeguards really helped to underpin trust. Another example of the importance of context was that if automation was going to allow data to be analyzed that may otherwise go unreviewed or unanalyzed, and lead to a general improvement of capability, then enthusiasm would be higher. But on the other hand, if automation was going to allow biases to become amplified, to result in information from certain demographic groups being targeted disproportionately, then enthusiasm would be dampened. Still, again, an acceptance that bias couldn't necessarily be eliminated entirely, whether it was courtesy of a human or machine. And as a result, going back to that point around safeguards and including independent oversight, that incorporates different diverse perspectives, seen as really essential. Towards the end of the findings here. So one of the important conditions I alluded to earlier was quality assurance and human oversight. Members of the citizen panel were really reassured by the safeguards already in place. Marion's touched on that, but we gave them the opportunity to discuss how these safeguards might be updated, how they might evolve in light of new technologies coming down the pipe. And they focused on things like auditing, auditing to reduce bias, to ensure the effectiveness of automated systems that are being used. In particular, the auditing that enables greater transparency of things like who's had access to what data sets, what changes have been made to those data sets, and things like that. And some people even spoke of the need for more independence with regard to auditing authorities, new bodies perhaps who could ensure checks were robust and agencies weren't marking their own homework. So this idea of independence was really a sort of key variable in the minds of many participants who were sort of advocating for greater separation between those who design and deploy automated systems and those responsible for reviewing their performance. So a mixture here of enhancing these quality assurance processes, publicizing these processes a bit more as well, perhaps helping increase public confidence in matters of oversight and responsibility. Also broad agreement that human checks always needed to be in place prior to decision making in order to be able to hold something or someone rather accountable. And here it was reiterated that, you know, humans forming this kind of checking and oversight role really need to be empowered and trained appropriately to question what the machine is sort of putting to them in the right way. Also, finally, transparency about how safeguards have been updated to deal with new technologies. Really important because lots of these safeguards will already be in place. So transparency around how these connect to existing oversight will play a big part in reassuring people. So overall, a favouring of a high degree of human oversight for any use of automation, national security, prioritising explainable systems and more regular checks, even if this is at the expense of intrusion as more human operators become privy to sensitive data through those checks. So wrapping up now, this report really comes at a time where policymakers are actively considering the future investigatory powers, not just in the UK, but around the world, and how new technologies might be used to enhance investigative capabilities. So accuracy, fairness, the implementation of oversight, they are as important to the public as privacy. That's the sort of one of the first key takeaways. Intrusion doesn't exist in a vacuum. It links very strongly to the context and the purpose for which data is being analyzed and to how data processing is overseen and reviewed. For us, the implication of this is that agencies and oversight organizations should innovate, but they really need to be steadfast in ensuring quality assurance is there, that oversight procedures are robust in the face of a rapidly changing landscape. And secondly, many people assume quite little oversight of national security data processing, and their understanding of what does exist is very limited. So participants in our research really saw this as low-hanging fruit, an easy win, questioning really why governments were not taking this opportunity to inform more seriously. So the implication there being clear opportunities for governments to fill those knowledge gaps, for example, through awareness raising around current oversight mechanisms. So our primary recommendation really is to allow the findings to speak for themselves, for policymakers to ensure that public priorities can shape decisions around future automated data processing within UK national security. So we'd really encourage, national security agencies, law enforcement community, other bits of government to combine this evidence with their own internal priorities in order to reach more granular recommendations, and crucially to commission more of this type of research as well, not just in the UK, but around the world. I will leave it there. I think we've reached the end of the presentation. I think I should have put that slide on just now, but you get the picture.
No worries. Thanks, Ardi. I was just about to come in and say you're a bit of a time, but we've got some time for questions from the audience, and I can see there's a few already from some anonymous questions coming through. I'll perhaps start with the first one that came through. Before conducting the research, I imagine you both perhaps had your own assumptions regarding UK public perceptions of national security data processing, particularly following scandals like the Snowden revelations. Were there any findings that you thought were particularly surprising, and why? Maybe Ardi, you can start, and then Marion can also answer.
Findings that were particularly surprising. I think this idea around, I maybe didn't quite expect there to be so much variation. People care a lot about why their data is being processed. So there's a really large variation in support across operational purposes. Some had really high levels of support, and some had very, very low levels of support. And for some of the specific numbers, I thought that was the variation was a bit higher than I'd expect. The public is far more likely to support processing if the purpose of that is consistent with their interpretation of the organization or of the organization's role. That was perhaps less surprising, but I think some of the variation that we found, I think we had 79% for some, and then some down really in the low 20s, because most of our other stats and numbers were really quite bunched up, quite close together. But I think that was the one question where we had, maybe a swing of sort of 50%, 50-60% across different cases. But yeah, Marion, I'm sure you'll have thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think maybe the initial surprise for me was that there was a lack of knowledge about the fact that there were safeguards in place in terms of IPCO, etc. But I think that's probably down to me, and that's not anything to do with the public. That's because, I assumed, because I know about it, then everyone else knows about it. So that demonstrates that if you're working in this world, you have assumptions about it that actually are not true and need to be challenged. So I think that was a really interesting finding. But also what I found really impressive was, as I said in my section, is how interested, engaged and sensible all the people on our panel were, and how eager they were to get involved in the subject, understand it more, and contribute. And I think that was really encouraging. And what came out of it for me was the really important point that for the members of the public, it was not about intrusiveness per se, it was about the context and the use of the data analytics, and then how effective that was. So they appreciated that there was all sorts of levels of intrusiveness, but they really wanted to know why was this needed? Or is it going to be genuinely effective? And then who's going to check? Who's going to be overseeing this independently? Who's going to really look into the detail? And they really did also express concern about the level of knowledge that oversight bodies have. I mean, that was, although they had that trust in oversight bodies being there, they wanted to know that those oversight bodies were going to be effective, and they needed to have the right skills and the right sort of tools to get underneath the bonnet. So I think for me, those things were really important.
Thanks, Marion. There's another question here regarding the request by some participants for increased transparency and having more of a voice in oversight discussions. So that's links to what you just said, Marion. Can you say more about what these could look like in practice? Who wants to take that one first?
I could have an initial sort of go, and then hand over to Marion. There were some interesting ideas here around how members of the public might be placed alongside some of the judicial commissioners working for IPCO, or feed into them, sort of having maybe IPCO having their own sort of citizen juries and panels that they can sort of tap into. I think our main takeaway from that sort of question was the comms piece might really need a fundamental shift in the agency's approach to public engagement. So whether that looks like IPCO or the Home Office sort of running their own citizen panels, preempting public responses to proposed policy changes, and really communicating examples of how they are valuing public feedback. The public need to know that they're being listened to, is going to be a prerequisite to any sort of more intricate solutions that they end up landing on. But I know that there were some quite sort of ambitious proposals, maybe not all of which would necessarily be feasible given some of the sort of security restrictions that are placed around judicial commissioners and the information that they receive and are able to share. But definitely that shouldn't preclude, I think, more of this sort of deliberative work being done by government and not just by sort of civil society, third sector stakeholders like the Turing Institute. But yeah, Marion, any views?
Yeah, I remember that the citizen panel was suggesting, structures like having an ongoing panel that would be representative of the population that could sit alongside it, can be like a consultative body. That was a structure that they were quite keen on, and it's certainly something that happens in other contexts. So I think they were also very aware that there were certain things that couldn't be discussed or shared, but it was that more sort of long-term view that they were interested in getting involved with.
Thanks, Marion. I think that kind of relates to another question that was asked, which is, given that the public have only limited understanding of these issues, how should the government try and change this? This was partially answered with kind of raising awareness and some stuff being initiated by, say, the Home Office or other actors like IPCO. But are there any more things that you can add to respond to that question?
Well, I was thinking, I did think about this at the time, and I do think that then it's not going to be enough just to issue information on government websites about this sort of oversight and how it works. And I do think that more could be done in a more structured and regular way to really engage with sort of mass media outlets. Have people talking about this when there's relevant stories in the news, because I think that's the only way to get knowledge increased. I'm not sure that's really being done yet, but I think there are so many opportunities. I mean, we all. We've probably heard, for example, Jonathan Hall, KC, who's the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, who is often regularly on the news talking about various things, and by doing that, he very successfully sort of highlights what the legal issues are and what the concerns are, but also his own role that he does exist. And so I think it's that sort of level of engagement that's needed.
Just one thing to add to that, I suppose, on thinking about perceptions here. There was, I think, a mixture of surprise at how much, focusing here on the citizen panels, sort of a mixture of surprise at how much agencies could collect, and sort of quotes that are in the report around, wow, I didn't expect them, that they can go into some, such detail really on what they can collect, but then also juxtaposed with surprise at how many hoops they have to jump through in order to do so. So that, I think, links to this, or rather is preceded by perceptions amongst the public. I think amongst the people that we spoke to, perhaps we might have thought that they would be quite dominated by sort of James Bond style ideas of spying and sort of the sort of 007ization of national security. But really, there's a good graphic in the report about this, where we summarize all of the different instinctive views that participants had in this space. It was more shaped by their real life experiences of things like fraud and cybercrime and stories that they see in the media. So yeah, I think it's important to recognize that. And if there are members of the public who are taking their sort of day-to-day experiences of perhaps attempted being defrauded or attempted scams and cybercrime, which don't actually have a lot to do with national security data processing, but are nonetheless affecting their views of national security data processing, that seems like the sort of thing which is a problem, and from a government point of view is something which they should probably want to change. So that's quite, I think, low-hanging fruit in terms of getting the right information out there and getting the right stories out there. And yeah, we've touched on the oversight point quite a few times now. But yeah, hammering that home is I think pretty important.
Thanks, Ardi. I think there's time for maybe one more question. I'm just going to highlight to a colleague, Marion Oswald. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your surname. Just to highlight that this webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to get the details around the methodology and the data collection, and there's also the link to the report on our website. So yes, just because we have covered that at the beginning of the presentation. But the last question is around forward-looking. So are there any plans for any future research in the space? Any insights on the nature and frequency of future research in the space would be really interesting. That's a great question to kind of end the webinar. So yeah, over to you, Ardi and Marion.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, you know, we've had a really good reception to this research. We briefed it across numerous government departments, not just in the UK, but internationally as well. And hopefully that's going to inspire further research, not just from us, but across UK government and other governments around the world, where I think this sort of research was definitely lacking from the sort of open source literature review that we've been doing. So yeah, I think it's a watch this space sort of thing, and we're definitely keen to do more, because even though we had sort of 16 key findings, that there were lots that we weren't able to do, and I think a lot of that you can get a sense of in our limitations section in the methodology, some sort of constraints around the scenarios and the limitations that are associated with just having sort of 3 sessions with people over a couple of weeks. And what more can be done. So we know that there's a lot of thinking and a lot of work going on around government, in and around government, on this sort of thing, and different things being commissioned. But yeah, I think this will be one which we have to sort of keep plugging away with and keep hammering home the message of why it's important for governments to take seriously. I'm optimistic.
I think it also emphasises the need for more consideration of genuinely participatory methods of consultation and involvement. And that's something we're doing quite a lot about in other contexts around policing and the use of independent panels to help advise on the rollout of AI and other technologies. So I think there could be a lot more done to try and centralise that sort of thinking within government, and ensure that more is being done around the benefits of that sort of participatory method. Because certainly the citizens panels really emphasise there's a real interest in that, and it's got a lot of potential for increasing trust in what government is doing in this area.
Thanks. Yeah, great way to end the webinar. We're now approaching time, so I will bring this webinar to a close. Wanted to thank everyone who joined today, but a special thank you to our speakers, Ardi Janjeva and Professor Marion Oswald. Just before closing off, I just want to highlight the 2 upcoming webinars in this series. We've got another webinar on the 28th this month on privacy preserving moderation of illegal online content. And the 3rd one of the series is on the 19th of November with Ardi Janjeva as well, on AI and serious online crime. All the information on our webinars is on our website. That's cetas.turing.ac.uk. And finally, if you're interested in any of these issues that we discussed today and want to learn more about the research that we do in CETaS, sign up for the CETaS network. Again, you'll find the information on our website. Thank you, everyone.